topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Sports for kids in America began with what we affectionately called Sandlot Ball, where kids organized their own games, made their own rules, and played until the sun went down. Then came along parents.
I'm gonna get you tonight because you let me down, brother.
No, I'm not.
You did. I don't give what you do. You let me down. I don't care if you're gonna play 100%. I'll get you, buddy. Cry about that.
The National Alliance for Youth Sports was born out of a desire to bring order to the world of organized sports for children in America. While for the most part, children have a great experience playing sports, far too often parents and coaches lose perspective. This program is aimed at bringing some of America's best experts to talk about what we can do to change the atmosphere of win at all cost and parent poor behavior to one that focuses on children having a positive learning experience through sports. Here's our host, Fred Eng, the founder of the National Alliance for Youth Sports.
Morning, everybody, and thanks a lot for being here. We got a great show today with a member of our board of directors of the National Alliance for Youth Sports, Dr. Julie Partridge. And so we're really happy to have Julie here. Julie, you saw that guy in the beginning where he's got his arm around the guy. And let me tell you very briefly, I don't know whether you ever saw the whole story there, but ABC, You did see the whole thing with him?
Yeah.
It was pretty disgusting, wasn't it?
Yeah. I used to show it in my class, actually.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Was it on recently?
No, I actually had a copy of it that I purchased from ABC News or ABC Sports. I'm not sure which one I got it from, but I used to show the entire that entire documentary piece. Yeah,
amazing, wasn't it?
Yeah,
to see that. Well, I've tried to think about how I was going to introduce you because your position there as a professor at Southern Illinois University, but then it goes into sports psychology and then, human behavior and exercise science and whatnot. So do the viewers a favor and explain what that position is. And
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a professor of sport and exercise psychology at, as you mentioned, at Southern Illinois University. I'm currently actually serving as our interim school director for human sciences, but that's not my real job. My real job is being a professor. I teach courses in sports psychology, both at the undergraduate and graduate level, like applied sports psychology. So how can we use these principles to perform better? I also do teach, some exercise psych, kind of based more in like what can we do to be more like change behaviors related to just exercise. And then I have in the past, I haven't recently, but have also taught in like motor behaviors, so motor learning, motor development, those areas.
Man, you really got a busy. I don't know how you have time to serve on our national board, but I know all the members of the board are really happy that you're doing that for the organization. But back to the guy that we saw there in the beginning, what was your reaction? What speaking psychologically, what is that?
Yeah, so it's really, even if you haven't seen the rest of the video where it's kind of led up to this point where it's been very clear that this parent-child relationship seems, I think, tense, to start with. And then it sort of culminates in that part where you're watching, this person who is supposed to be, caring for their child and that sort of thing is making, some pretty strong threats. And even though he's mic'd up and you would think that he's kind of aware of the fact that that's going to be recorded, like he's kind of whispering and saying these things about, I'm going to get you tonight because you let me down. And again, and when you see the entire clip, the thing that he's mad about is that his son didn't feel like he was giving full effort during warmups. That there was a ground ball hit to him that he didn't think that his son had made a good effort at trying to get. So the reaction feels very outsized compared to what actually happened there. Yeah.
That's amazing. As you talk about all that and in your position, even though you're a professor, no, I don't mean it, even though you're a professor.
No, that's okay.
Have you ever counseled a parent? Have you ever had the occasion to counsel somebody? And what would you say to them?
Yeah. So I haven't necessarily had a parent that's come to me on the sports psych side to talk about their own behavior in a more, what's the word I want to use, like formal sense. But I have coached youth sport before and have had conversations with a lot of parents, and even ones that even up through like the college level, going to watch games here, knowing who some of the parents are of players that I'm watching, and having them kind of talk sometimes about like, oh yeah, I used to get really fired up about things, or I had to figure out how to calm down, and having those conversations with, parents of players that I've coached before. And a lot of them know kind of what I do. So sometimes they'll feel like they need to say, again, like, oh, I used to be really bad about this, or I've really learned how to control my temper, or those types of things. But also, in coaching, kind of having conversations at the beginning about, these are the expectations we have for parents. This is what we'd like to see happen. I think is an important one, but also not always an easy conversation to have, because a lot of times people don't realize what behaviors they're engaging in until somebody maybe has to point something out.
Yeah. I mean, in my 40 years of being involved in all this, I've probably heard 100 to 500 stories. Mm-hmm. And the one that sticks out a lot to me is that I used to bring together all the national organizations like Little League and Pop Warner and all of them. And we had a conference, and they're all talking about this issue of parents and their parent behavior. And this woman that was there raised her hand, and I never forget it. I'm thinking, she was the wife of the editor or publisher of a youth athlete magazine. Uh-huh. And I'm thinking, oh, what's she going to say? I mean, it was great to have her there, but she was just sitting in and raised her hand. And she started talking about being at a game with one of her kids, and the umpire comes over and says to her, "You're going to be out of here. One more comment from you." She's like, are you talking to me? What have I done? She said, I was just humiliated. She said, but then the next inning, he comes over, points at me and says, "You're out of here." And she said, it's the most humiliating, embarrassing thing I can ever remember of happening to me. But I didn't know why I did that and why I behaved that way. Why do you think somebody that doesn't know it, that they're behaving that way, why do they do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think a lot of times we don't always gauge our own behavior very accurately. This veers off just a little bit, but like when we look at coaching behaviors, for example, one of the things that we know is that coaches are actually not great at identifying what behaviors they engage in when they're coaching. They'll know, obviously, a lot of them, but it's kind of been a pretty consistent finding that if you have somebody that's observing coaches and from an outside perspective, like marking down their behaviors, and then you ask coaches, that doesn't match up as well as when you ask players what their coaches were doing. Athletes are actually pretty accurate with it. And I think it's just one of those things that when you're on the receiving end of somebody yelling, or there's, behaviors that are happening and you're on the receiving end of it, you're probably just going to be a little bit more accurate with it than the person who's saying it when you don't realize, always the things that you're saying. Now, when somebody's already given you a warning and you're still doing it, that's a whole other thing, which is, you'd think that it might have been a little bit like, okay, I need to take it down a notch. But I think just sometimes we aren't very accurate with what we're actually doing. And a lot of times we do not know how we're being perceived. Like what we think we're saying and how it's being received is just sometimes different than what we think it is.
Yeah, you say that, and I wonder, I've often thought and said, nobody is immune to this behavior.
Yeah.
I mean, myself, I'm sure you, but with whoever it is, they're sitting in the stands. It's our flesh and blood out there. And we have this tremendous urge if something doesn't go the way of our child, whether it's from the umpire, whether it's a coach not playing them, whatever. And it's so difficult. How does a parent stay on the other side of the line to say, I want to get out there and scream at this guy, but I got to sit back. What is the control factor there?
Yeah, so I think awareness is obviously always hopefully part of it. So as I said, sometimes people just aren't as aware of it. I do think this is one area where sometimes having a good group of parents in the stands can help to, I don't want to say police each other's behavior, but sometimes when somebody else that maybe is a parent of another child on the team that you are maybe friends with, saying like, hey, let's go maybe just walk down to the end and come back, and like you're getting a little fired up or whatever. Sometimes having somebody else, again, to kind of watch out for others can be really helpful, because again, left to our own devices, and we see it with fans all the time too. I was at our conference men's basketball tournament last week, and there were fans around us getting really, really amped up. And of course, complaining about calls from the refs, and each successive call is going to be perceived as being terrible now, because one bad call gets made, or one call that's maybe borderline, and now every single call is terrible. And you just think, man, if we could just pause this for a second, or somebody around them could be like, hey, you're making a fool of yourself, like take it down, just take it down a little bit. I do think sometimes that can be helpful to have somebody external that is, a friend or somebody that, just to kind of give that. I mean, obviously, I think it's important to have conversations about the expectations for parent behaviors with a team and all of those things. But those conversations a lot of times happen at the beginning of a season. And so if you aren't reminding of it constantly, or again, it's a big game, it's a championship game, or it's a playoff game, or it's whatever, then people can start to lose that a little bit. So I think some of it can be parent peers helping with that, is one strategy that I've tried to implement when I've had, parents that I think are maybe going to get a little out of control.
One of the words when I first started getting out and meeting people after the organization was created, I kept hearing the word vicarious, people living vicariously through their child. I used to think about that, and I became to a point of saying, nah, it's not that. It may be some of that, but there's a lot of other things that are not me living through my child. And, I didn't make the baseball team, but my kid's going to damn sure make the team, and all of that vicarious stuff. But it just seems that people do things that are not. Like, I was at a game one time with one of our kids were playing, and a guy came out of the stands and grabbed a baseball bat and started attacking the umpire with a baseball bat. And I'm like, whoa. And that's when I began to say, no, that's not vicariously living through your child there. You're some kind of criminal, and maybe that's what it is. And we have so many people there that behave that way because they're criminals.
Yeah.
What's your reaction?
Yeah, I think we've maybe talked about this before. I know Dan Juan and I have had conversations about it. But, I think there's also an element that, again, the vicarious thing is one that we hear a lot. But I do think there's also a certain amount of people identifying very strongly with their child, which makes sense. Like, of course, you're going to. I think it sort of manifests itself in a few different ways. So like if you go to a youth sport game now, lots of times you'll see a parent with like, a jersey on with their kid's name on the back. Whereas, you would see that at a professional game where it's like a professional player. So
Right.
I think there's a really strong identification with a team. They sometimes react aggressively if they perceive that, the team is being treated unfairly. And I think, there's a strong identification there. It's not about like, well, I'm being thwarted in my, dreams because my kid got called out, but it's like you're treating my child unfairly. And that's basically the same thing as treating me unfairly. And I'm not allowing that to happen. So yeah, I think there is something to that there's just such a strong identification there that anything that happens to the child, any unfairness, any perceived slight, any whatever, is met in much the same way that sometimes sports fans react to a bad call with a team that they follow. Yeah.
So I know you're busy with 100 other things you got to do when you leave here. So I only have one more thing I want to ask you to react to.
Okay.
With the Alliance, the National Alliance for Youth Sports, we have each week called a press box. And I want to show you what we do, and then I want to ask your reaction to this. So if one can show the press box. Now you saw those things on there.
Yeah.
That's not just from this year.
Right.
That's from this week. So the thing that troubles me, and I would imagine you and many other people, is, are we making any gains by what we're doing when we see all of this? What's your take with it?
Yeah, I would love to say that we are, but yeah, it's troubling to see those pop up. And like you said, this isn't coming from like, well, this was all from within the last year, but within the last week. I think I do think there's headway that's being made, but I do also think that those headlines get clicks and that, those things coming out, are things that are like shocking to people sometimes. So it's like, oh my gosh, what happened here? But I do think, without going too broad on this, I do think that we continue to filter down more and more pressure on kids with what the perceived rewards are of being good in sports, that you've got to start being good and showing how good you are really, really early on. Because now it's not, the brass ring used to be a scholarship, right? Like, oh, I want my kids to do well here so that they can continue to move up the ladder and eventually get a college scholarship. For a lot of people, that was like, oh, that's what we're kind of shooting for. And now obviously and I'm not advocating against it, but just with the advent of NIL and the fact that there's a lot more money that's kind of involved, I think it continues to put pressure on things as you move down. I don't know if that's a reason why we still see a lot of this stuff, but I do feel like, that there's just this blurring of like, this is youth sport. This should be skill development. This should be for fun. This should be for them to learn whether, do I even like this sport or do I want to try a different one? Let me find something that matches for me. And there tends to be a very strong, like, you better be good at this from the start. This is like competitive from the beginning. Like, and the more pressure that's applied there, the more we can expect people to react maybe not so great when things don't go the way that they want them to. So how's that for a non-answer? But I like to think we're making strides, but I do think there continue to be forces that make that youth sport realm still a lot of pressure for kids. Yeah. And
Yeah,
kids.
while you're saying that, I keep going back to the very beginning, and why I got into the whole thing is because of saying, pardon me, why isn't anybody doing anything about this? And of course, after we came along, we, the National Alliance for Youth Sports, then thankfully a lot of the national, almost all the national organizations have some kind of training and introduction to coaches. But it's got to go more than that. And so I will leave you with this saying, there's so much more that we can talk about, and I sure hope that we can get back together in one of the future episodes. So with that, I'm going to let you go and get back to work doing great work you do.
I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm sorry that I couldn't stay on longer. It's the week after spring break, and so everybody wants to has a meeting for me to be at, unfortunately, on campus. So, but I very much enjoy the opportunity to talk, and absolutely, let's do this again soon.
All right, Julie. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's Dr. Julie Partridge, Southern University, and very knowledgeable in this whole area. So I want to thank everybody for being on again this week. And next week, we've got another guest, former hockey player, who's going to talk about some really interesting things about violence in youth hockey. So join us then.
This program is sponsored by SurDerf Publishing in the interest for better sports for kids. Better kids for life.
In this best-selling book, a child, while failing to live up to his father's expectations, is shamed and humiliated beyond belief. He vows to never allow his own son to face the same.